I wanted to review graded washes with you, and your original video talks about using a puddle. That still works, but there are other ways that you can go about this that you might find at this stage of the game to be a little easier to do. And the other thing about doing graded washes, aside from the fact that they're probably the most difficult thing to learn in watercolor, is that different pigments react differently. So I'm going to do a yellow, a red, a blue, and a green, because those are the colors that we use a lot. Let's start with yellow, which, as we all know, is probably the most forgiving of all of the pigments when it comes to doing gradations. I'm going to do a graded wash with the puddle. We'll do it first on dry paper, and I'm just using geometric shapes, which are the most difficult to do. But in this case, you can see I am using the puddle. You don't need a lot of puddle. So here's your puddle. Now we'll clean the brush, and we'll start to pull this down. If you use the side of the brush rather than the tip of the brush, you get a little bit more of an even tone. Don't go too far. Just a little ways, and you can see I still have some puddle here going on. But clean your brush, or every time you've lifted the brush from the paper. So here is our yellow on dry. Let's do the red on dry. I'll move this up. And I'm just using Scarlet Lake. And you want to take it about a third or more down into your shape. Clean the brush and pull it down again. Staying in the puddle area, don't go up into the area that you've already blended. And usually you can get away with a dry paper application if you have a very small area that needs to be painted. But as you can see, this is not being quite as cooperative. Now we'll do a blue, an ultramarine, because it has a tendency to settle. Make sure you mix it. Make sure your puddle is at the bottom here. Clean the brush. And go about a third of the way in, and bring it down another third. Clean the brush. Go in about a third from where you left off, and you can see that ultramarine is a bit more stubborn when it comes to the graded washes, because it tends to settle very quickly. I'm just using Sap Green for this next one. Again, I have a good angle on the paper so that gravity helps with the transition. Clean the brush. Again, you're using a side sweep and using the side of the brush rather than the tip of the brush. And green is a little bit more cooperative than blue. The yellow is the one color that is, among the pigments that we have, that is the easiest to do in a dry situation. If you have real small areas, much smaller than this, that you need a gradation, you can just lay that color in there and grade it really, really quickly. Without having to worry about puddles or anything else. So the next thing we'll do is just a wet, and that means I'm going to dampen the page first. Make sure that it's not shiny, and you'll see that almost every pigment is a little happier when it has some moisture in the paper. I am going to moisten the red and the yellow. I don't want to go too far because things dry out in this heat, but you're going to have to tip the page I don't know if you're going to be able to see it on camera, but you don't want this to be shiny. You want it to be kind of a matte finish. You just want the moisture to go into the paper. So then we'll do our yellow. And basically we're going to do the same process that we did before. This time I'm just going to wipe the brush off and then start to bring it down, then clean the brush when I've brought it down a little bit and finish the gradation. Let's do red. Just wipe the brush off so you pick up some of this puddle. Drag the pigment down. Then clean the brush with water and do your last transition. If you have too much moisture in it, just pick it up. Or I'm going to dampen the paper for the blue and the green. I'll wait for it to get satiny, and then we can paint. All right, let's do the blue. Dry off the brush and pull some of that color down. Clean the brush and finish off. And if you want it to blend even more, clean it once, clean it again. And just touch the bottom edge. Do not go into that transition. Now we'll do the green. Dry off the brush. And it starts to get dry. Clean the brush with water. And now soften this edge. And this transition got a little bit out of hand because the paper dried a little too much. So I'll add a little bit more green here. This is another technique that you can use. And if you recall when you did your tint chart, we had put down a light wash and then we let it dry and then we put down another light wash for the next step. And actually you probably don't really need to wet the paper. You can just use a very thin wash of color. The thin layer of color will actually create some moisture in the page. All right, so let's do red. Very thin layer. And it's going to depend on how you want your gradation to be. If you want it to be really light down here, you've got to make sure that whatever your base layer is going to be very light. So here's a red. You can see it's very light, and I am using a puddle to create the flat wash first. So now we have a flat wash. I'm going to do the same with ultramarine blue. And blue seems to be much happier when it's done in very light layers. And it will build up very nicely, as you'll see as we go along here. Now we'll do the green. Yellow now is dry. So what are we going to do? We're going to go with the same concentration that we did when we put this flat wash down. But we're not going to go as far. We're going to take that color and we're going to take it down about 2/3 because we need to have the gradation down at this bottom edge. So where you have an edge now, you've got to clean the brush, take the moisture out of the brush, and gently feather this so that it just blend that bottom edge to what's already there. This technique requires multiple layers of color. You can't do it in 1 or 2 steps like you can with some of these other gradations. Clean the brush and then feather that edge. Just barely touching the bottom edge of the color. Let's do blue. Clean the brush, just touch that bottom edge. And if you still have a streak, clean the brush, touch the bottom edge, just the bottom edge, and there you have your blend. So let's do green. Same concentration. Could be a little drier. This works best if you let it dry. Just touch the bottom edge to feather it out. Alright, so we now have a nice gradation on the green. Now we need to wait for this to dry a little bit more before we do another round. Now while we're waiting for this stuff to dry, we can take these light values that we have and we can retouch and correct some of the faults that we have with these other blends very easily. I'm going to do the blue because that's the one that's the most irregular, and I'm just going to take a very, very light shade of blue because you don't want to put down something that's too dark. You can do this with your number 2 miniature, and you just take some of this color. You don't want a whole lot of paint in the brush. And where you have light areas, you can just lightly feather in, just by almost like a stipple technique. Once you've touched that up, you have to wait for it to dry. And what you're doing is you're matching the color around it to even things out. Build this gradually in order to get everything to blend nicely. Don't touch the dark areas, just touch the light areas so that you're matching what's next to it. And even on this one, I'm going to just blend in a little bit of color in this transition area. All right, this should be dry enough that we can work on our blends again. So I'm going to switch back to my number 4 brush, and I'm going to do another layer of yellow. Not go quite so far this time. And I'm just going to feather that in. All right, let's do red. At this point, you want to take some of the moisture out of the belly of the brush because you don't want it to be too wet. Clean the brush, take most of the moisture out of the brush, and feather that in. If you're still getting a line after you've moved it, clean the brush again, feather it in. You can see how nicely that's starting to blend. The one thing about this is you have to be very careful about your edges so that you don't have multiple edges on a shape. So that's about how you want to do this.